In the gleaming towers of Manhattan's financial district, a driven investment executive was about to face an impossible choice. What started as the most important deal of her career took a devastating turn when she came face to face with the true cost of ambition. Sarah Mitchell wasn't your typical Wall Street climber. For 18 years, she had spent her life building an empire of success at the expense of family connections. Known for her ruthless dedication to closing million-dollar mergers. When she encountered her mother's sudden death on the same day, as a career-defining $5 million deal, she had no idea she was walking into a moral reckoning that would expose decades of corporate corruption and force her to choose between everything she'd worked for and everything that truly mattered. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light sliced through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Sarah Mitchell's corner office, casting geometric shadows across the mahogany conference table where her entire future lay spread in neat manila folders. At 32, she had clawed her way to senior account executive at Blackstone & Associates, one of Manhattan's most prestigious investment firms, and today, October 15th, would either crown her ascent or destroy everything she'd sacrificed to build. Sarah adjusted her charcoal Armani blazer and smoothed an invisible wrinkle from her skirt, a nervous habit she'd developed during her first year on Wall Street. The Sterling Industries merger documents demanded her attention, but her eyes kept drifting to the framed photo on her desk, not of family, which would have been a weakness in Richard Blackstone's world, but of her Harvard MBA graduation ceremony. Alone in her cap and gown, diploma held high, the image represented everything she'd chosen over the disappointed faces that hadn't bothered to attend. $5 million, she whispered to herself, the number that would transform her from ambitious employee to youngest partner in company history. The Sterling deal had consumed 18 months of her life, late nights that stretched until dawn, weekends spent crafting proposals instead of returning phone calls from Connecticut, holidays sacrificed on the altar of corporate advancement. Today, Victoria Sterling herself would arrive to finalize the acquisition that would absorb her tech startup into a Fortune 500 conglomerate, and Sarah would be the architect of that transformation. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Chen, her colleague and the closest thing she had to a friend in this marble and glass tower. Ready to make history? Coffee's on me afterward, if you can still afford to be seen with the little people. Despite herself, Sarah smiled. Marcus possessed that rare ability to navigate corporate waters without drowning his humanity, something she'd long ago decided was a luxury she couldn't afford. The preparatory meeting with Victoria Sterling arrived with military precision. Sarah had studied every aspect of Sterling Industries' operations, memorized quarterly reports, and anticipated every possible objection or complication. Victoria proved to be exactly what Sarah expected, sharp-eyed, direct, and utterly focused on maximizing value for her shareholders. They worked through final details with the efficiency of two professionals who understood that sentimentality had no place in business. "I appreciate your thoroughness, Sarah," Victoria said, gathering her papers. "It's refreshing to work with someone who understands that success requires sacrifice." The words hit Sarah strangely, though she couldn't identify why. Perhaps it was the way Victoria's gaze lingered on the absent family photos, or the faint sadness that flickered across her features when she mentioned sacrifice. But there was no time to analyze such subtleties. Richard Blackstone's arrival always commanded absolute attention. Richard swept into the conference room like a force of nature, his silver hair perfectly styled, his $1,000 suit a testament to 3 decades of choosing profit over people. At 58, he had built his empire by demanding total loyalty from his employees and offering ruthless efficiency to his clients. Sarah had learned to read his moods in the micro-expressions that crossed his angular face, and today she detected satisfaction mixed with something that might have been anticipation. "Victoria, always a pleasure," Richard said, extending his hand with practiced charm. I trust Sarah has demonstrated why we're the premier firm in Manhattan for transactions of this magnitude. They were deep in discussion about afternoon logistics when Sarah's phone rang. The display showed James Mitchell, and her stomach clenched with familiar guilt. She'd ignored his last 3 calls, too consumed with deal preparation to handle whatever family drama required her attention. He knew better than to call during work hours unless— "Excuse me," she said, stepping toward the window. "I need to take this." "Sarah?" James's voice cracked with emotion she'd never heard before. "Mom's gone. She had a heart attack this morning. She's gone, Sarah." The world tilted sideways. Through the glass, Manhattan continued its relentless motion. Yellow cabs threading through traffic, pedestrians flowing along sidewalks, life proceeding as if nothing fundamental had shifted. But inside Sarah's chest, something vital had stopped working. "What do you mean, gone?" The words emerged as a whisper. She collapsed in the kitchen around 7. Dad found her when he came down for coffee. The paramedics said it was massive. Instantaneous. She didn't suffer. James's voice broke completely. "We need you here, Sarah. The funeral is Wednesday. We need to—" Wednesday. Today was Monday. The Sterling deal closed Wednesday afternoon. "I can't," Sarah began, then caught herself. Richard and Victoria were watching her with the predatory attention of sharks sensing blood in the water. "I'm in a meeting. Can I call you back?" "A meeting?" James's grief transformed into something harder. "Our mother is dead, and you're worried about a meeting?" The line went dead. Sarah stared at her phone, James's words echoing in her mind while her professional instincts screamed. Warnings about the 2 people studying her every reaction. 18 months of work, partnership, everything she'd built. "Family emergency," she managed, returning to the table. Victoria's expression shifted slightly, something almost maternal flickering in her eyes. "Is everything all right?" Before Sarah could formulate a response, Richard intervened with the precision of a surgeon removing diseased tissue. "I'm sure it's nothing that can't wait until after we close on Wednesday. Family matters have a way of resolving themselves, but business opportunities like this are irreplaceable." The casual dismissal hit Sarah like a physical blow. She found herself studying Richard's face, searching for some recognition of her humanity, some acknowledgement that she might need a moment to process devastating news. Instead, she saw only the calculating assessment of a man who viewed empathy as weakness and loyalty as a commodity to be purchased. "My mother died," Sarah said quietly. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of unspoken truths about the cost of the life she'd chosen. Victoria's intake of breath was sharp, sympathetic. Richard's expression didn't change at all. "My condolences," Richard said finally, his tone suggesting he was discussing quarterly projections. "When is the service?" "Wednesday." "Ah." Richard leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "That presents a conflict. Sarah, I need to be absolutely clear about something. This deal closes Wednesday at 3 o'clock. Victoria has coordinated her entire executive team around that timeline. Moving it would cost everyone involved significant money and potentially jeopardize the entire transaction. Your presence isn't just expected, it's non-negotiable." Sarah felt the walls of her carefully constructed world closing in. The partnership she'd dreamed of, the validation she'd spent years earning, the moment that would prove every sacrifice had been worthwhile. All of it balanced against the funeral of a woman she'd spent a decade avoiding. "Surely there's some flexibility," Victoria began, but Richard cut her off with a look that could freeze steel. "Business is about priorities, Victoria. Sarah understands that better than most. She's made similar choices before." His gaze locked onto Sarah's. "Haven't you, Sarah? When was the last time you went home for Christmas? Or your father's birthday? Success requires focus, and focus requires sacrifice. The truth in his words was devastating because it was absolute. She hadn't been home for Christmas in 3 years. She'd missed her father's 60th birthday for a client dinner. She'd chosen this path deliberately, cutting family ties like dead weight that would only slow her ascent. Marcus appeared in the doorway, drawn perhaps by the tension radiating from the conference room. His dark eyes immediately found Sarah's face, reading the devastation she was struggling to conceal behind professional composure. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Marcus said carefully. "Sarah, if you need anything." The offer hung in the air like a lifeline, but Sarah could already feel Richard's disapproval radiating across the table. In his world, needing anything was tantamount to failure, and failure wasn't tolerated among those who aspired to partnership. "Thank you, Marcus," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. "But everything's under control." The lie tasted bitter, but it was the only truth Richard wanted to hear. She watched Marcus's face fall slightly as he recognized her choice, the familiar pattern of watching her select professional obligation over human connection. He nodded once and withdrew, leaving Sarah alone with the two people who represented her past and future, the client who might understand, and the boss who definitely wouldn't. "Well then," Richard said, rising from his chair with satisfaction. "I believe we're finished here. Victoria, we'll see you Wednesday at 3. Sarah, I trust you'll use the next 2 days to ensure every detail is perfect. Partnership decisions are made during moments like these." As they gathered their papers and prepared to leave, Sarah remained frozen at the conference table, her phone still clutched in her hand. 24 hours ago, she'd thought she understood the price of success. Now she realized she'd been paying in installments without understanding the total cost. The choice stretched before her like an abyss. Attend her mother's funeral and destroy her career, or close the deal that would validate every sacrifice she'd made. In the silence of the empty conference room, surrounded by the debris of her crumbling certainties, Sarah Mitchell finally understood that some prices could never be repaid. Her phone buzzed with another call from James. This time, she let it go to voicemail. Sarah's finger hovered over the voicemail notification as the conference room door clicked shut behind Richard and Victoria. The silence felt suffocating, broken only by the distant hum of Manhattan traffic 40 floors below. She pressed play, knowing she shouldn't, unable to stop herself. "Sarah, it's me again." James's voice was raw, exhausted. "Dad's not handling this well. He keeps asking when you're coming home. I don't know what to tell him anymore. The funeral. Home needs decisions about everything. Mom would want you here. Please, just call me back." The message ended with a soft sob that cut through Sarah's carefully constructed defenses like a blade. She set the phone down with trembling hands and stared at the Sterling Industries documents spread across the mahogany table. 18 months of work reduced to paper and signatures, but those signatures represented everything she'd sacrificed to achieve. "Focus," she commanded herself, the mantra that had carried her through Harvard, through her first brutal year on Wall Street, through every moment when human feeling threatened to derail her ambitions. She had 48 hours to ensure the Sterling deal proceeded flawlessly. Everything else was a distraction she couldn't afford. The Sterling merger negotiations resumed at 2 o'clock with Victoria's full legal team present via video conference. Sarah slipped into her professional persona like armor, her voice steady and authoritative as she guided them through regulatory compliance issues and final asset valuations. But beneath the surface, her mother's voice echoed from memories she'd spent years suppressing. "You're becoming someone I don't recognize, Sarah." Helen Mitchell's words from their last real conversation 3 years ago, delivered with the disappointed resignation that had defined their relationship since Sarah left for college. When did achieving something become more important than being someone? Sarah had dismissed the comment then as her mother's inability to understand ambition, but now it felt prophetic. When had achieving become more important than being? When had she stopped being Helen Mitchell's daughter and become only Sarah Mitchell, senior account executive? Sarah? Victoria's voice cut through the haze of memory. The liability clauses need your input. Of course. Sarah forced herself back to the present, diving into the technical details that usually brought clarity to her thoughts. But today, even the familiar rhythm of negotiation felt hollow, mechanical. She caught Victoria studying her with concern during breaks, and twice had to ask colleagues to repeat questions she'd missed entirely. At 4:30, her phone vibrated with a text from her father. "Your mother kept every article about your promotions. She was so proud, even when she was frustrated. She loved you, Sarah. We both do." The words hit harder than James's anger or Richard's callousness. Her father's gentle forgiveness felt undeserved, a gift she wasn't sure she knew how to accept. Sarah excused herself and stepped into the bathroom, gripping the marble sink as her carefully maintained composure finally cracked. She allowed herself 30 seconds to grieve, 30 seconds to be Helen Mitchell's daughter instead of Richard Blackstone's protégé. Then she splashed cold water on her face, reapplied her lipstick, and returned to the conference room where millions of dollars waited for her expertise. The afternoon wore on with excruciating precision. Every contract clause reviewed, every financial projection verified, every potential complication anticipated and addressed. Sarah's performance was flawless, the culmination of years spent perfecting the art of corporate negotiation. But as 6 o'clock approached and Victoria's team prepared to adjourn until Wednesday's closing, she felt increasingly untethered from her own life. "Excellent work today," Victoria said, gathering her materials. "You've anticipated every concern we discussed. This is exactly the kind of thorough preparation that builds lasting business relationships." Sarah nodded, accepting the praise. That should have felt validating, but instead felt hollow. As Victoria moved toward the door, she paused, her expression softening. "Sarah, may I speak frankly?" Without waiting for permission, Victoria continued. "I lost my mother when I was 26, ovarian cancer. I thought building my company was more important than spending time with her during those final months. I told myself I was securing our family's future, that she'd understand once I succeeded." The confession hung between them like a bridge. Sarah wasn't sure she was ready to cross. "Did she?" Sarah asked quietly. Victoria's smile was sad, knowing. "She died proud of what I was building, but I think she would have traded all my success for one more afternoon together. The company I thought was so crucial? It's just another business now. But those missed afternoons, those are gone forever." After Victoria left, Sarah sat alone in the dimming conference room, watching the sunset over Manhattan's steel and glass canyon. Her phone showed 17 missed calls from James, 4 from her father, and 2 voicemails she couldn't bring herself to hear. The sterling documents seemed to mock her from the table, proof of professional competence achieved at the cost of human connection. Marcus appeared in the doorway, 2 cups of coffee in hand. He set one beside her without speaking, then settled into the chair Victoria had vacated. "My father died on a Tuesday," he said finally. "I was in Shanghai, closing a deal for emerging markets expansion. The time difference meant I got the call at 3 in the morning, but the signing was scheduled for 8. I told myself he'd understand that I couldn't abandon months of work for something I couldn't change anyway." Sarah looked up from her coffee, seeing her own pain reflected in Marcus's dark eyes. "Did you go?" "I stayed, closed the deal, got the promotion, and I've regretted it every day since." Marcus leaned forward, his voice gentle but urgent. "Sarah, I've watched you build walls around everything human inside you. I've seen you choose career advancement over friendships, over relationships, over any connection that might slow your climb. But this isn't just another choice. This is your mother. You don't understand? I understand perfectly. I understand That Richard Blackstone has convinced you that feeling anything makes you weak. I understand that you've spent so long avoiding emotional attachments that you've forgotten how to value them. But I also understand what it feels like to stand at a graveside and realize that all your professional achievements mean nothing compared to the time you'll never get back. The truth in his words was devastating because it was absolute. Sarah had indeed forgotten how to value human connection, had trained herself to see emotional needs as weaknesses to be eliminated. But sitting in the growing darkness, surrounded by the monuments to her ambition, she felt the cost of that training more acutely than ever before. The partnership will mean nothing if you lose yourself earning it, Marcus finished. I've seen what Richard becomes when he gets everything he wants. Is that really who you want to be? As if summoned by their conversation, Sarah's phone rang again. This time, it was her father. She stared at the display, paralyzed by the weight of choice. Answer and face the grief she'd been avoiding, or let it ring and preserve the illusion that she could compartmentalize this pain like every other human feeling. Marcus reached across the table and gently took her hand, the first genuine human contact she'd experienced all day. Whatever you decide, he said softly, you don't have to face it alone. The phone stopped ringing, but the echo of connection lingered. In 48 hours, Sarah would have to choose between the partnership she'd spent years earning and the last chance to honor the woman who'd given her life. As night fell over Manhattan, she finally began to understand that some choices couldn't be undone and some prices could never be repaid. The phone stopped ringing, leaving Sarah staring at her father's contact information on the darkened screen. Marcus's hand remained over hers, warm and steady, an anchor in the storm of competing loyalties that threatened to tear her apart. For a moment, sitting in the gathering darkness of the conference room, she almost called her father back, almost chose the grieving family over the gleaming partnership. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Then her training reasserted itself. Richard Blackstone's voice echoed in her memory. Success requires focus, and focus requires sacrifice. She had made her choice 18 months ago when she'd committed everything to the sterling deal. Wavering now would invalidate every sacrifice she'd already made. I have to see this through, she said quietly, withdrawing her hand from Marcus's grasp. The deal closes tomorrow. Marcus's expression shifted from understanding to disappointment, but he nodded slowly. I hope you can live with that choice. After he left, Sarah worked until midnight, reviewing every clause and contingency with obsessive precision. She fell asleep at her desk and woke to find Richard standing over her at 6 a.m., coffee in hand and satisfaction etched on his angular features. Dedication, he said approvingly. This is why you'll make partner, Sarah. This is what separates the winners from the emotional casualties who let personal feelings derail professional opportunities. The sterling deal closing proceeded with choreographed precision. Victoria's executive team arrived promptly at 2:30, their legal advisors flanking them like an army preparing for negotiated surrender. Sarah orchestrated the final review, with mechanical efficiency, her expertise guiding them through regulatory requirements and financial projections that would merge two companies into a more profitable whole. But something had fundamentally shifted in her internal landscape. Where yesterday she would have felt exhilaration at each signed document, today she experienced only hollow competence. The numbers that should have thrilled her, $5 million, in fees, guaranteed partnership track, industry recognition, felt abstract, disconnected from any meaningful sense of achievement. Outstanding work, Victoria said during a brief recess, but her praise carried an undertone of concern. Are you feeling all right? You seem distant. Sarah manufactured her most professional smile. Just focused on ensuring perfection. This deal represents the culmination of everything I've worked toward. Victoria studied her with the intensity of someone who recognized performance masquerading as authenticity. And your family situation? Handled, Sarah lied smoothly. Business always comes first. At 4:15, Victoria Sterling signed the final document that would transfer ownership of her company. Richard immediately produced champagne, Dom Pérignon that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, and the conference room filled with congratulations and networking small talk. Sarah accepted the accolades with practiced grace, playing her role in the corporate theater that had consumed her life. To Sarah Mitchell, Richard announced, raising his crystal flute, whose dedication and sacrifice exemplify everything this firm represents. I'm pleased to inform everyone that partnership discussions will commence immediately. The applause should have felt triumphant. Instead, Sarah found herself thinking about her father sitting alone in their Connecticut kitchen, surrounded by 40 years of shared memories with a woman who would never come home again. She thought about James making funeral arrangements without his sister's input, shouldering responsibilities that should have been shared. She thought about her mother's final moments, facing death without knowing if her estranged daughter would even attend her service. Her phone buzzed with a text from James. Funeral at 2 p.m. tomorrow. Dad asked me to send you the address, just in case you change your mind. The message included a photo, their parents' wedding picture from 1985. Helen Mitchell looked radiant, in white lace, her smile genuine and unguarded in a way Sarah barely remembered. David stood beside her in a rented tuxedo, his expression proud and tender. They looked like people who believed love could conquer any obstacle, who trusted that family bonds would endure any test. Sarah stared at the image until her vision blurred, then excused herself to the bathroom where she could compose herself away from Richard's calculating gaze. In the mirror, she saw a stranger, impeccably dressed, professionally successful, and emotionally hollow. When had she become someone her younger self wouldn't recognize? When she returned to the conference room, Marcus was waiting by the windows overlooking Manhattan's glittering expanse. Most of the celebration had dispersed, leaving only empty champagne flutes and the lingering scent of expensive perfume. "How does it feel?" he asked quietly. "Like exactly what I've worked for," she replied automatically. "That's not what I asked." Sarah joined him at the window, watching the city lights blur into abstract patterns. "It feels like nothing. Like, I've spent years climbing a mountain only to discover it's just another hill with a slightly better view." Marcus turned to face her, his expression compassionate but uncompromising. "It's not too late, you know. The partnership will still be there next week. Your mother's funeral won't. You don't understand the sacrifices I've made to reach this point. I understand that you're about to make a sacrifice that can never be undone." Marcus's voice carried the weight of personal experience. "When my father died, I told myself that honoring his memory meant succeeding in ways he never could. But honoring someone's memory means showing up when it matters, not achieving things they'll never see." Richard's voice cut through their conversation like a blade. "Sarah, a word in my office." His corner office occupied prime real estate with panoramic views of Central Park. Awards and photographs documented 30 years of corporate conquests, deals closed, competitors crushed, fortunes made through strategic ruthlessness. Sarah had always seen this office as a temple to professional achievement. Tonight, it felt like a mausoleum. "Exceptional work today," Richard said, settling behind his mahogany desk. "Victoria was particularly impressed by your composure under pressure. Not everyone could have maintained focus while dealing with personal distractions." Personal distractions. Her mother's death reduced to an inconvenient interruption of business priorities. "The partnership committee meets Friday," Richard continued. "Your performance today demonstrated exactly the kind of unwavering commitment we require from senior partners. Family emergencies, personal crises, emotional attachments, these are luxuries that successful people simply cannot afford. He leaned forward, his pale eyes boring into hers. I see myself in you, Sarah. The same hunger, the same understanding that excellence demands sacrifice. Most people lack the strength to make truly difficult choices. They let sentiment override strategy, emotion override efficiency. But you understand what I understood 30 years ago, that achieving greatness requires abandoning everything that makes you ordinary. Sarah nodded mechanically, but his words felt like a diagnosis of terminal illness. Was this really who she wanted to become? Someone who viewed her mother's death as a personal distraction? Someone who measured worth only in profit margins and partnership announcements? Get some rest, Richard said dismissively. Tomorrow we begin preparations for the Morrison acquisition. Success builds on success, and you've proven you have what it takes to build an empire. As Sarah gathered her belongings, her phone showed 14 missed calls from her family. Tomorrow, while she attended strategy meetings and planning sessions, her mother would be laid to rest without her eldest child present. The partnership she'd won felt like fool's gold, shiny and worthless. Purchased with currency she could never earn back. Standing in the elevator as it descended toward the street, Sarah finally understood that some victories were indistinguishable from defeat. She had achieved everything she'd dreamed of, and it meant absolutely nothing. The doors opened onto the Manhattan night, and Sarah stepped into a world where success had never felt more like failure. The doors opened onto the Manhattan night, carrying Sarah into the humid October air that felt thick with unspoken regrets. She walked the 40 blocks to her Upper East Side apartment instead of taking a cab, needing the rhythm of movement to quiet the chaos in her mind. Every step carried her further from the gleaming tower where she'd just achieved her greatest professional triumph, and closer to a reckoning she'd spent years avoiding. Her apartment felt sterile in the way that expensive spaces often do, all marble countertops and designer furniture carefully arranged to project success rather than comfort. Sarah poured herself a glass of wine she didn't want and stared at her phone, where 17 unread messages waited like accusations. James's final text included funeral details she'd memorized despite herself. Riverside Cemetery, Section C, 2 p.m. While her mother was being lowered into Connecticut soil, Sarah would be sitting in a strategy meeting for the Morrison acquisition. Sleep came in fragments punctuated by dreams of her childhood home, the yellow colonial with blue shutters, where her mother had hung report cards on the refrigerator and waited up when Sarah stayed late at debate practice. In her dreams, Helen Mitchell was always watching from the kitchen window, her expression unreadable as Sarah walked away down the tree-lined street, suitcase in hand, never looking back. She woke Friday morning with a decision crystallizing. In her consciousness, she needed to go home. Not for the funeral she'd already missed, but for whatever remained to be salvaged from the wreckage of her family relationships. The drive to Connecticut felt like traveling backward through time. Highway markers counted down the miles to a life she'd deliberately left behind, each exit sign triggering memories she'd trained herself to suppress. As Manhattan's skyline disappeared in her rearview mirror, Sarah felt something loosening in her chest, a tension she'd carried so long she'd forgotten it wasn't natural. The Mitchell family home sat on Elm Street like a monument to middle-class stability, its modest proportions dwarfed by the McMansions that had sprouted around it in recent years. Sarah sat in her BMW for 10 minutes, gathering courage she'd never needed for corporate negotiations. The familiar yellow paint looked faded, and her mother's flower garden showed signs of neglect that spoke to months of gradual decline. James answered the door with red-rimmed eyes and 3 days of stubble, looking like a man who'd aged years in a week. His expression cycled through surprise, hurt, and resignation before settling on weary acceptance. "You missed it," he said, quietly. "She's buried next to Grandma and Grandpa, like she wanted." "I know. I'm sorry." The words felt inadequate, but they were all Sarah had. James stepped aside to let her enter the house that had once been home. The living room looked smaller than her memories suggested, filled with furniture that had seemed elegant in her childhood, but now appeared simply worn. Family photos covered every surface: school plays and birthday parties, Christmas mornings and graduation ceremonies. Sarah's image appeared frequently until college, then sporadically, then not at all in recent years. "Dad's in the kitchen," James said. "He's been sitting there since we got back from the cemetery, just staring at her chair." David Mitchell looked fragile in a way that broke Sarah's heart. At 62, he'd always seemed indestructible. Broad shoulders from 40 years of construction work, calloused hands that could fix anything. A quiet strength that anchored their family through every crisis. Now he appeared diminished, as if Helen's death had stolen some essential part of his substance. "Sarah." His voice carried no accusation, only exhausted love. "I'm glad you came." She sat in the chair that had been hers during countless family dinners, feeling like an intruder in her own history. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I should have been here." "Your mother understood about your work," David said carefully. "She was proud of what you'd accomplished, even when she worried about what it was costing you." The gentle forgiveness hurt worse than anger would have. Sarah found herself studying the kitchen with new eyes, noticing details that spoke to a life fully lived: recipe cards in her mother's handwriting, a grocery list still magnetic clipped to the refrigerator, reading glasses folded beside a half-finished crossword puzzle. "She kept everything," James said, following her gaze. "Every newspaper article about your promotions, every mention of your deals." She'd read them aloud to Dad and say, "Our Sarah's making her mark on the world." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. While she'd been avoiding her family out of guilt and professional ambition, her mother had been collecting proof of her achievements, maintaining pride in a daughter who'd all but abandoned her. "There's something else," David said quietly. He disappeared upstairs and returned with a shoebox wrapped in faded ribbon. She wrote these but never sent them, found them in her nightstand. Inside were dozens of letters addressed to Sarah's Manhattan office, spanning 3 years of careful handwriting on Helen's favorite lavender stationery. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened the first one, dated just 6 months ago. "My dearest Sarah, I saw the article about your promotion in the Wall Street Journal. Your father cut it out for our scrapbook, though I suppose you think that's silly. I know you're busy building your career, and I'm proud of everything you've achieved. But I miss my daughter. I miss our talks about everything and nothing. I miss being part of your life instead of just reading about it in newspapers. I love you more than my own life, even when you're too busy to remember that. Love always, Mom." Sarah read letter after letter, each one a masterpiece of restrained, longing, and unconditional love. Her mother had documented every major deal, every promotion, every mention in trade publications. But between the lines of maternal pride ran a deeper current of loss. A woman watching her eldest child disappear into a world that had no room for family connections. The final letter was dated just 2 weeks before Helen's death. "I dreamed about you last night. You were 8 years old again, helping me plant tomatoes in the garden. You had dirt under your fingernails and grass stains on your knees, and you were laughing at something silly I'd said. When I woke up, I missed that little girl so much it took my breath away. I know she's still there somewhere, underneath all that success and sophistication. I hope someday you'll let her come home." Tears Sarah hadn't allowed herself to shed finally came, great gasping sobs that seemed to tear something loose inside her chest. James sat beside her, and David's weathered hand found her shoulder. And for the first time in years, she felt held by something larger than professional ambition. "She never stopped believing you'd come back to us," David said softly. "Even when you stopped calling, stopped visiting, stopped being part of this family, she'd say, 'Sarah's just lost right now, but she'll find her way home.'" As evening shadows lengthened across the familiar kitchen, Sarah began to understand the true scope of what she'd sacrificed. Not just her mother's funeral, but years of accumulated moments that could never be recovered. While she'd been building a career that felt increasingly hollow, she'd been throwing away relationships that might have sustained her through any crisis. But sitting surrounded by evidence of love she'd never deserved and forgiveness she'd never earned, Sarah also glimpsed something else, a possibility of redemption that began with truth. Starting with the truth about the Sterling deal, the company she'd served so faithfully, and the man who'd taught her that success required abandoning everything human. Her phone buzzed with a message from Richard. Morrison's strategy meeting moved to Monday. Rest up. We're going to need your full attention. For the first time in her career, Sarah Mitchell didn't care what Richard Blackstone needed. She had more important work to do, beginning with discovering who she might become if she stopped trying to be the person her ambition had demanded. The cracks in her foundation had become fissures, and through them, something like hope was beginning to grow. Sarah spent the weekend in Connecticut, helping her father sort through 40 years of accumulated memories, while learning to see her childhood home through adult eyes unclouded by ambition's distortions. Every conversation with David and James revealed another layer of love she'd dismissed as weakness, another sacrifice they'd made while she pursued success in Manhattan's glass towers. Sunday evening, driving back to the city with her mother's letters carefully boxed in her passenger seat, Sarah felt like she was returning to a foreign country where she no longer spoke the native language. Her apartment's sterile perfection now felt suffocating rather than sophisticated, each expensive piece of furniture a monument to priorities she was beginning to question. Monday morning arrived with Richard's summons to discuss the Morrison acquisition, but Sarah found herself reluctant to slip back into the corporate persona that had once felt like armor. Instead, she arrived early at the office and did something she'd never done before. She began reviewing the Sterling deal documents not for compliance issues, but for patterns that might reveal uncomfortable truths. What she found made her stomach clench with recognition. Hidden in the maze of subsidiary transfers and offshore holdings were discrepancies that spoke to systematic manipulation. Payment structures that benefited shell companies with no clear business purpose. Asset valuations that seemed inflated beyond market reality. Financial transfers that occurred days before official signing, as if someone had advance knowledge of confidential terms. Sarah's investigative instincts, dormant under years of corporate conditioning, suddenly blazed to life. She'd spent so long focused on executing deals flawlessly that she'd stopped questioning whether those deals were ethical. Now, with her mother's words echoing in her memory, "I hope someday you'll let her come home," she began to see patterns that should have been obvious. Marcus found her at lunch, hunched over spreadsheets in the empty conference room where she'd received news of her mother's death just 5 days earlier. "You missed the Morrison meeting," he said, setting a sandwich beside her laptop. Richard was not pleased. "Marcus, look at this." Sarah turned her screen toward him, highlighting the suspicious transactions. "The Sterling deal, there are payments flowing to entities that shouldn't exist. Someone's been skimming money from client accounts." Marcus leaned closer, his expression shifting from concern to alarm as he processed what she was showing him. "Sarah, this is serious. If you're right about this." "I am right, and it's not just Sterling." Sarah pulled up files from previous deals, her fingers flying across the keyboard with urgent purpose. "Look at the Henderson merger from last year. Same pattern, and the Westfield acquisition. Someone's been running a systematic scheme to divert funds from client transactions." Someone meaning Richard? The name hung between them like an accusation. Neither wanted to voice. But as they dug deeper into the firm's digital archives, the evidence became undeniable. Richard Blackstone had been orchestrating a sophisticated embezzlement operation, using his senior partner's access to manipulate deal structures and redirect funds to accounts he controlled. "How long has this been going on?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Years. Maybe decades." Sarah's hands trembled as she compiled the evidence. And we've been complicit. Every deal we've executed, every client we've advised, we've been helping him steal from them. The realization hit like a physical blow. All her professional achievements, every promotion and bonus and recognition had been built on a foundation of systematic fraud. She wasn't just Richard's protégé. She was his unwitting accomplice in crimes against every client who'd trusted their firm with their financial futures. Her phone buzzed with a text from James. "Dad wanted me to thank you for this weekend. He said it was like having his daughter back." The message crystallized everything Sarah was feeling. For the first time in years, she'd acted like Helen Mitchell's daughter, rather than Richard Blackstone's creation. Now she faced a choice that would determine who she wanted to be for the rest of her life. "We have to expose this," she said quietly. Marcus's face went pale. "Sarah, do you understand what you're saying? This would destroy the firm. Our careers, our reputations, everything we've built. Everything we've built on lies." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "My mother spent her life teaching high school students about integrity. She believed that doing the right thing mattered more than personal advancement. I forgot that lesson somewhere along the way, but I'm remembering it now. Richard will crush us. He'll make sure we never work in finance again. Then we'll work somewhere else, doing something that doesn't require us to ignore systematic theft from people who trusted us." Sarah began copying files to a secure drive, her movements decisive despite the tremor in her hands. "My mother died believing I was building something worthwhile. I won't let that be another lie." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with the intensity of someone seeing her clearly for the first time. "You know, when I started here, I wanted to change the world through ethical investing. I thought I could work within the system, be a voice for conscience in an industry that desperately needed one. What happened?" "Richard happened. He taught me that conscience was a luxury I couldn't afford if I wanted to succeed. Every small compromise led to a larger one, until I couldn't remember what I'd originally stood for." Marcus reached for her hand across the conference table. "But watching you these past few days, seeing you choose your family over your career, even if it was too late, it reminded me who I used to be." Sarah felt something shift between them, a recognition of shared values that had survived years of corporate conditioning. "Will you help me? Help you commit career suicide by exposing the most powerful partner in one of Manhattan's premier investment firms?" Marcus's smile was rueful, but determined. "Absolutely." They spent the afternoon building an airtight case, documenting every suspicious transaction and tracing the complex web of shell companies Richard used to launder stolen funds. With each revelation, Sarah felt simultaneously sickened by her complicity and energized by the possibility of redemption. As evening approached, her phone rang. Victoria Sterling's name appeared on the display, and Sarah answered with the strange certainty that this call would be significant. "Sarah, I'm glad I caught you. I've been reviewing some post-merger financial reports and there are discrepancies I can't explain. Payment authorizations that don't match our agreements, fund transfers that seem irregular. I was hoping you might help me understand what's happening." Sarah looked at Marcus, who nodded encouragingly. The moment of truth had arrived faster than expected, but perhaps that was for the best. Secrets had a way of festering in darkness. Truth required light to heal the wounds they'd caused. "Victoria, I think we need to meet in person. There are things about your deal, about our firm, that you need to know." "How serious are we talking?" Sarah gazed out at Manhattan's skyline, thinking about her mother's letters and her father's forgiveness, about Marcus's courage and her own long-buried conscience finally fighting its way to the surface. Serious enough to change everything. The die was cast. Sarah Mitchell was about to declare war on the only professional world she'd ever known. Armed with nothing but evidence, and the belated understanding that some battles were worth losing everything to fight. The meeting with Victoria Sterling was scheduled for Tuesday evening at a discreet restaurant in Soho, far from the financial district where Richard's network of associates might observe them. Sarah spent Monday night organizing the evidence into an irrefutable narrative of systematic fraud, each document another nail in the coffin of her former life. Tuesday morning brought Richard's summons to his corner office, the same space where he'd callously dismissed her mother's death as a personal distraction. Now, studying his collection of awards and conquest photographs, Sarah saw them differently. Not monuments to success, but trophies taken from victims who'd never realized they were being hunted. Sarah, I'm concerned about your focus since returning from your family obligations. Richard's pale eyes studied her with predatory intensity. Marcus mentioned you've been reviewing old deal files. Nostalgia is an indulgence we can't afford when the Morrison acquisition demands our full attention. I've been ensuring our compliance standards meet regulatory requirements, Sarah replied carefully. Due diligence protects the firm's reputation. Our reputation is built on results, not second-guessing successful transactions. Richard leaned forward, his voice carrying an edge of warning. I've invested considerable time developing your career, Sarah. I'd hate to think that investment was misplaced. The threat was unmistakable, delivered with the same casual cruelty he'd shown when learning of her mother's death. Sarah felt her resolve crystallize into something unbreakable. Of course not, she said smoothly. Your guidance has taught me everything I know about priorities. That afternoon, Sarah's phone rang while she was copying the final pieces of evidence. Her father's name appeared on the screen, and she answered with genuine warmth, a response that would have been impossible just weeks ago. How are you holding up, sweetheart? David's voice carried the gentle strength that had anchored their family through every crisis. I'm doing something Mom would be proud of, Sarah said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. It's going to cost me my career, but I think she'd say some things are more important than professional success. Your mother always believed that doing right mattered more than doing well, David replied quietly. She worried you'd forgotten that lesson, but she never stopped believing you'd remember it when it counted. After they hung up, Sarah sat in her office as Manhattan's afternoon shadows lengthened, thinking about the woman who'd raised her to value integrity above advancement. Helen Mitchell had spent 30 years teaching teenagers that character was measured not by achievements, but by choices made when no one was watching. Now her daughter faced the most important test of that philosophy. The restaurant Victoria had chosen was intimate and quiet, with secluded booths that provided privacy for sensitive conversations. Sarah arrived early, her briefcase containing evidence that would detonate like a bomb in the carefully constructed world of high-stakes finance. Victoria appeared precisely on time, her expression shifting from business-like efficiency to concern, as she read Sarah's face. You look like someone preparing to deliver devastating news. That's an accurate assessment. Sarah opened her briefcase and withdrew the first document. Victoria, what I'm about to show you will change everything. You think you know about your merger, about our firm, about the man who's been managing your account. For the next hour, Sarah walked Victoria through the labyrinthine scheme Richard had constructed. Shell companies that existed only to funnel money from client accounts, inflated valuations that masked systematic theft, payment structures, designed to obscure rather than illuminate financial reality. With each revelation, Victoria's expression grew darker. How much? Victoria asked finally, her voice tight with controlled fury. From your deal alone? Approximately $2 million. But Richard's been running this operation for years. The total theft is probably in the tens of millions. Victoria sat back in her chair, processing the magnitude of betrayal. And you knew nothing about this? I suspected nothing, Sarah. Corrected. I was so focused on executing deals perfectly that I never questioned whether those deals were ethical. Richard trained us to see moral concerns as obstacles to success rather than essential guidelines. Why are you telling me this? You realize it will destroy your career. Sarah thought about her mother's letters, about the love she'd dismissed as weakness and the values she'd abandoned as inconvenient. Because my mother spent her life teaching that integrity matters more than personal advancement. I forgot that lesson for a while, but I'm remembering it now. Victoria's expression softened slightly. The mother who died last week, the funeral you missed. For a deal that was built on fraud from the beginning. Sarah's voice carried the weight of accumulated regret. I chose professional loyalty over family love. And it turns out the profession I was loyal to was corrupt from its foundation. What do you want from me? Help? Richard has powerful connections throughout the financial industry. If I try to expose this alone, he'll destroy my credibility and bury the evidence. But if a prominent client like you comes forward with concerns about irregularities, it legitimizes the investigation and protects you from retaliation. Victoria nodded slowly. But it also means admitting I was victimized by sophisticated fraud. That's not exactly the kind of publicity that helps business confidence. Sarah leaned forward, her voice urgent with conviction. How many other clients has he stolen from? How many pension funds and charitable foundations and small investors have lost money because Richard saw them as marks rather than clients? We have the power to stop this, but only if we act together. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, studying the evidence spread across their table. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the steel that had built her company from nothing. My mother worked 3 jobs to put me through college. She believed that success meant lifting others up, not tearing them down for personal gain. If Richard Blackstone thinks he can steal from people like her and face no consequences, he's about to learn otherwise. Relief flooded through Sarah like a tide. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. This is going to get ugly before it gets better. Richard won't go down without a fight, and he has resources we can barely imagine. As they prepared to leave, Victoria asked one final question. What made you change your mind? What made you willing to sacrifice everything you'd worked for? Sarah thought about her mother's unsent letters, about forgiveness she'd never earned and love she'd never deserved. I realized that everything I'd worked for was built on lies, and I decided I'd rather have nothing that was real than everything that was false. Walking back through Soho's narrow streets, Sarah felt lighter than she had in years, despite knowing that tomorrow would bring Richard's wrath and the destruction of everything she'd built. For the first time since leaving Connecticut 18 years ago, she was walking toward something rather than away from it. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Whatever happens next, you're not facing it alone. The battle for her soul was about to begin in earnest, but Sarah Mitchell finally knew which side she was fighting for. Wednesday morning arrived with the deceptive calm that precedes hurricanes, Manhattan's skyline sharp against an October sky that promised change. Sarah dressed carefully, her best navy suit, the one she'd worn for her first partnership meeting, knowing it might be the last time she wore it as Richard Blackstone's protégé. Victoria had wasted no time. By 9 a.m., federal investigators from the Securities and Exchange Commission were already reviewing the evidence Sarah had compiled, their questions precise and devastating. By 10:30, the preliminary findings were sufficient to warrant a formal investigation into Blackstone and Associates' business practices. Sarah was in her office, organizing files with the methodical precision of someone burning bridges behind her, when Marcus burst through her door with an expression of barely controlled panic. "It's starting," he said, closing the door firmly. "Richard just got a call from his attorney. The SEC is requesting records for every major deal from the past 5 years. They know Sarah, and they know you're the source." Before Sarah could respond, her phone rang. Richard's extension, the display showing his name like a summons to judgment. She answered with surprising calm. My office. Now. The line went dead. Marcus gripped her arm gently. You don't have to face this alone. Yes, I do. This is my choice, my responsibility. Sarah gathered the personal items from her desk. Her mother's letters, the photograph from Harvard graduation that no longer seemed meaningful. But thank you for standing with me. Richard's office felt different now. Not a temple to success, but a lair where predators had planned the systematic exploitation of trust. He stood with his back to the door, staring out at Central Park, as if memorizing a view he might not see much longer. 24 hours, he said without turning around. That's how long it took you to destroy everything I've built. Everything we've built together. I didn't destroy anything, Richard. I just stopped pretending that theft was success. He turned then, and Sarah saw something she'd never witnessed in his pale eyes. Genuine emotion, though whether it was rage or desperation, she couldn't tell. You have no idea what you've done. The collateral damage from your moral awakening will destroy innocent people. Our staff, our clients, everyone whose livelihood depends on this firm. The clients you've been stealing from? They're the innocent? People, Richard. We're the ones who betrayed their trust. Trust is a luxury, Sarah. A fairy tale for people who don't understand how the world actually works. Richard moved to his desk, his movements controlled but tension radiating from every line of his body. I created opportunities where none existed. I generated wealth that improved lives. If some of that wealth found its way to accounts I controlled, it was compensation for services that couldn't be officially recognized. The rationalization was breathtaking in its audacity. Sarah studied the man who'd shaped her professional identity, searching for some recognition of moral reality beneath the layers of self-justification. You stole from pension funds, Richard, from retirement accounts, from charitable foundations, trying to help vulnerable people. You turned our clients' trust into personal profit. I turned their investments into returns they never could have achieved through conventional means. Richard's composure finally cracked, his voice rising. Every client made money, Sarah. More money than they would have made with any other firm. The fact that I also profited from my expertise is simply intelligent business practice. By manipulating documents and creating false entities to hide theft. By maximizing value in ways that small minds like yours couldn't appreciate. Richard leaned forward, his eyes boring into hers with predatory intensity. But you've chosen to destroy that value out of some misguided sense of righteousness, inherited from a dead woman who never understood ambition. The casual cruelty of the reference to her mother hit Sarah like a physical blow, but it also crystallized everything she'd come to understand about the man she'd once admired. My mother understood that character matters more than profit. Something you never learned. Character? Richard laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. Character is what people invoke when they lack the courage to do what's necessary for success. Your mother was a high school teacher who died in obscurity. I've built an empire that shapes global markets. Which of us understood ambition? Sarah stood, her voice steady despite the fury building in her chest. She understood that empires built on stolen foundations eventually collapse. She understood that success without integrity is just elaborate failure. We'll see about that. Richard's smile was cold, calculating. You think exposing me will vindicate your newfound morality? You think destroying this firm will somehow honor your mother's memory? You're about to learn that noble gestures have consequences. As Sarah moved toward the door, Richard's voice followed her like a curse. I made you, Sarah. Everything you've achieved exists because I saw potential in a mediocre girl from Connecticut and molded her into something worthwhile. Without me, you're nothing. Sarah paused at the threshold, thinking about her mother's letters and her father's quiet strength. about Marcus's loyalty and her own belated recognition of what truly mattered. "You're right," she said quietly. "Everything I was came from you. But everything I'm choosing to become comes from people who loved me despite my failures rather than because of my success." The elevator ride to the ground floor felt like descending from a poisoned mountain peak toward cleaner air. As the doors opened onto the marble lobby where she'd once felt pride in her professional achievements, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from James. "Dad and I are driving down to the city. Whatever happens next, you're not facing it alone." The warmth of that message sustained her as she walked through the revolving doors into Manhattan's afternoon chaos. Behind her, the glass tower that had housed her ambitions rose into an October sky that promised storms. Ahead lay uncertainty, professional exile, and the probability of legal battles that would consume months or years of her life. But for the first time since leaving Connecticut 18 years ago, Sarah Mitchell was walking toward something she could believe in rather than away from values that inconvenienced her ambitions. The point of no return lay behind her now, along with the woman who'd confused achievement with worth and success with character. Her phone rang again, Victoria Sterling, calling with news that the federal investigation was expanding beyond Blackstone and Associates to examine Richard's network of shell companies and offshore accounts. The storm Sarah had unleashed was gathering strength, and there would be no shelter from its winds. But standing on a Manhattan sidewalk with her mother's letters in her briefcase and her family driving through the night to support her, Sarah discovered that storms could be purifying as well as destructive. Some things needed to be torn down before better things could grow in their place. The storm Richard had promised arrived with devastating swiftness. By Thursday morning, news of the SEC investigation had leaked to the financial press, sending shockwaves through Manhattan's investment community. Sarah woke to find her name trending on financial news sites, her photograph accompanying articles that painted her alternately as a courageous whistleblower and a disgruntled employee seeking revenge against her former mentor. The firm's response was surgical in its precision. By noon, Sarah received notice that she was suspended pending internal investigation, her access to company systems revoked, her corporate credit cards canceled. Richard's legal team, led by one of Manhattan's most ruthless white-collar defense attorneys, had already begun crafting a narrative that would destroy her credibility while preserving whatever remained of his reputation. Marcus found her in a coffee shop near the office, hunched over her laptop as she read increasingly vicious attacks on her character from anonymous sources that were obviously connected to Richard's damage control operation. "They're calling you unstable," Marcus said, sliding into the seat across from her. "Claiming your mother's death triggered some kind of emotional breakdown that compromised your judgment." "Of course they are." Sarah closed her laptop, feeling strangely calm despite the character assassination unfolding in real time. Richard's playing from his standard playbook, destroy the messenger to discredit the message. It gets worse. They're alleging that you manipulated the Sterling deal documents yourself, that you're trying to frame Richard for crimes you committed. Marcus's expression was grim. "Sarah, they have resources we can't match. Legal teams, public relations experts, connections throughout the industry. What about you? Are you facing any retaliation?" Marcus's laugh was bitter. "I'm suspended as of an hour ago. Apparently, I'm also suffering from emotional instability brought on by misplaced loyalty to a colleague in crisis." He reached across the table and took her hand. "But I'd rather be unemployed with a clear conscience than employed as an accessory to theft." The afternoon brought Sarah's first formal interview with federal investigators, two agents whose questions revealed the scope of the expanding investigation. Richard's scheme had tentacles reaching into dozens of deals over nearly a decade, affecting pension funds, charitable foundations, and individual investors whose retirement savings had been systematically siphoned into offshore accounts. "We're looking at potential losses in excess of $50 million, Agent Martinez explained, her voice carrying the weight of cases that destroyed lives rather than just careers. But the evidence suggests this operation has been running much longer than initially suspected. How much longer? Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. Possibly since Mr. Blackstone became a senior partner. We're finding irregularities dating back 15 years, which means hundreds of clients may have been affected. The magnitude of Richard's crimes was staggering, but what devastated Sarah was the realization of her own unknowing complicity. Every deal she'd executed with pride, every client relationship she'd managed with professional care, had been corrupted by systematic theft she'd been too focused on advancement to notice. That evening, James and David arrived at her apartment with takeout Chinese food and the kind of unconditional support she'd forgotten her family possessed. David looked older than his 62 years, but his presence filled Sarah's sterile apartment with warmth that no amount of expensive decoration could provide. "How are you holding up, sweetheart?" David asked, studying her face with paternal concern. "I keep thinking about all the people who trusted us with their money. Retirement funds that were supposed to secure their old age, charitable donations, meant to help vulnerable populations. Richard stole from all of them, and I helped him do it without even knowing." "You stopped it," James said firmly. "When you found out what was happening, you chose to expose it despite knowing it would cost you everything. That's what matters." "Mom would be proud," David added quietly. "She always said that admitting mistakes takes more courage than avoiding them." As if summoned by the mention of Helen's values, Sarah's phone rang with a call from Victoria. Sterling. The conversation that followed revealed the human cost of Richard's crimes in stark detail. "3 more clients have come forward," Victoria reported. "A teacher's pension fund in Ohio lost nearly $8 million over 5 years. A cancer research foundation in Seattle had $2 million diverted from treatment programs. Sarah, there. Are real people suffering because of what Richard did?" The weight of collective responsibility settled on Sarah's shoulders like a physical burden. "What can we do to help them?" "The FBI is tracing Richard's offshore accounts, but recovery will take time. Meanwhile, these organizations are struggling to fulfill their obligations to the people they serve. Teachers who expected secure retirements, cancer patients who needed funded research, they're all victims of Richard's greed." After the call ended, Sarah sat with her family in contemplative silence, processing the scope of damage caused by the man she'd once admired. The partnership she'd sacrificed her mother's funeral to pursue now felt like a pact with the devil, offered at a price she could never have imagined paying. "There's something else," Marcus said, arriving with news that sent chills down Sarah's spine. "Richard's legal team is preparing character assassination on an unprecedented scale. They're claiming you suffered a psychotic break after your mother's death, that you fabricated evidence out of grief-induced paranoia." "Let them," Sarah said, surprising herself with her steadiness. "The evidence speaks for itself. Financial records don't lie, even when the people who created them do. They're also threatening to sue you personally for defamation and corporate sabotage. They want to destroy you financially as well as professionally." David's voice cut through the room with quiet authority. "Then we fight them." Everyone turned to look at the man who'd spent 40 years building things with his hands rather than manipulating numbers for profit. "You think a retired construction worker doesn't understand corruption?" David continued. "I've seen contractors cheat on materials, supervisors take bribes, developers cut corners that put lives at risk. And I've learned that sometimes the only way to stop corruption is to stand up to it, regardless of the cost. Dad? Your mother spent 30 years teaching kids that character matters more than convenience. She believed that doing right was more important than doing well. If fighting for those principles means losing everything we own, then that's a price worth paying." James nodded firmly. "We're family, Sarah. That means we face this together." As night settled over Manhattan, Sarah looked around her apartment, at the expensive furniture that no longer impressed her, at the view of Central Park that had once symbolized success, at the family whose love she'd nearly thrown away in pursuit of empty achievements. Tomorrow would bring more attacks on her character, more legal threats, more attempts to destroy her credibility and her future. But tonight, surrounded by people who valued her humanity more than her professional accomplishments, Sarah Mitchell felt richer than she'd ever felt in Richard Blackstone's gleaming tower. The storm was far from over, but she was no longer facing it alone. Her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Sarah, this is Dr. Emily Chen, Marcus's sister and a civil rights attorney. Marcus told me what you're doing. If you're serious about fighting this, I'd like to help. Some battles are too important to lose." The cavalry was gathering, and Sarah began to believe that truth might actually triumph over power, even when that power seemed overwhelming. The consequences of her choice were becoming clear, but so were the allies willing to stand with her against institutional corruption. Tomorrow would test whether justice could survive in a world where wealth tried to buy immunity from accountability. That test arrived with the precision of a court calendar, 6 weeks after Sarah first discovered the irregularities that would reshape her understanding of success and corruption. The federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan stood like a monument to the principle that no one was above the law, though Sarah had learned that principle faced constant challenges from those with sufficient resources to mount sophisticated defenses. Richard Blackstone had assembled a legal team that cost more per hour than most families earned in a year, led by Thomas Hartwell, an attorney whose reputation for destroying prosecution witnesses was legendary. Sarah sat in the witness section, flanked by Emily Chen and Marcus, watching as the prosecution presented evidence that had consumed months of her life to compile. Agent Martinez methodically walked the jury through the labyrinthine scheme Richard had constructed: shell companies layered like Russian dolls, financial transfers designed to obscure rather than illuminate, client accounts systematically drained, over years of seemingly legitimate transactions. When Assistant U.S. Attorney Catherine Ross called Sarah to the stand, the courtroom felt electric with anticipation. This was the moment Richard's defense had been preparing for: the systematic destruction of the woman who'd brought down one of Manhattan's most respected investment firms. "Ms. Mitchell," Prosecutor Ross began, "please tell the court about your relationship with the defendant." Sarah looked directly at Richard as she answered, her voice steady despite the weight of his cold stare. "Richard Blackstone was my mentor, my boss, and for many years, the person I most admired in the financial industry. I believed he represented everything I wanted to become professionally. When did that perception begin to change?" "The day my mother died." Sarah's voice caught slightly, but she pressed on. "Richard's response to my family emergency made me question his humanity. That led me to question other things I'd accepted, without examination." For 2 hours, Sarah detailed her discovery of the fraudulent scheme, walking the jury through documents that revealed the systematic theft of client funds. She testified about her initial admiration for Richard's success, her gradual recognition of his moral bankruptcy, and her decision to expose crimes that had stolen from teachers, cancer researchers, and countless others who'd trusted their financial futures to Blackstone and Associates. Then Thomas Hartwell rose for cross-examination, and Sarah faced the most vicious character assassination of her life. "Ms. Mitchell, you missed your own mother's funeral to close a business deal, correct?" "Yes." That suggests a rather callous disregard for family obligations, doesn't it? Emily Chen's objection was sustained, but the damage was done. For the next 3 hours, Hartwell painted Sarah as an unstable woman who'd fabricated evidence out of grief-induced paranoia, a disgruntled employee seeking revenge against a mentor who'd failed to promote her quickly enough. "Isn't it true, Ms. Mitchell, that you discovered these alleged irregularities only after learning that partnership decisions had been postponed due to firm restructuring?" "No, that's completely false." "Isn't it true that you were passed over for promotion to senior partner 3 times in 2 years?" And I was never promised any specific timeline for advancement. Isn't it true that you blamed Mr. Blackstone for your mother's death because he required you to work instead of attending her funeral? The question hit Sarah like a physical blow, its cruelty designed to trigger an emotional response that would undermine her credibility. She could feel the jury's attention intensifying, waiting to see if she would break under pressure. I blamed myself for my mother's death, Sarah said quietly. I blamed myself for choosing professional advancement over human connection. Richard Blackstone didn't force me to make that choice. He simply created a culture where making any other choice seemed impossible. So you admit your judgment was compromised by guilt and grief. Sarah looked out at the gallery where her father and James sat in the front row, their presence a reminder of love that transcended professional achievement. Behind them, she saw Victoria Sterling and other clients who'd been defrauded, people whose trust had been systematically violated by the man she'd once called mentor. My judgment was clarified by grief, Sarah said finally. Losing my mother taught me the difference between success that builds something meaningful and success that destroys everything that matters while accumulating empty trophies. Hartwell pressed harder, attempting to portray her as mentally unstable, professionally incompetent, and motivated by personal vendettas rather than ethical concerns. But with each attack, Sarah felt her resolve strengthening rather than weakening. Richard had taught her to view empathy as weakness, but she was discovering that empathy could be a source of strength when directed toward protecting others rather than advancing herself. The prosecution's rebuttal was devastating. Catherine. Ross presented testimony from 3 forensic accountants who'd traced Richard's offshore accounts, revealing the true scope of his theft. Expert witnesses explained how the defendant had exploited client trust to fund a lifestyle of luxury purchased with stolen money. But the most powerful moment came when James Mitchell took the stand as a character witness for his sister. Sarah called me the night she decided to expose the fraud, James testified. She was crying, not from fear about her career, but from guilt about all the people who'd been hurt while she was unknowingly helping Richard steal from them. She said our mother had taught us that protecting people mattered more than protecting ourselves. Did she seem mentally unstable to you? She seemed like someone who'd finally remembered who she really was underneath all the professional armor she'd built up. She seemed like our mother's daughter again. The closing arguments crystallized the central question: was Sarah Mitchell a vindictive employee fabricating evidence out of personal grievance, or a conscientious professional who'd found the courage to expose systematic corruption despite knowing it would destroy her career? Richard's defense painted him as a visionary businessman whose aggressive strategies had generated unprecedented returns for clients, whose complex financial arrangements were legitimate tax optimization rather than theft, whose only crime was succeeding in ways that less innovative minds couldn't understand. The prosecution's closing focused on the human cost of Richard's crimes: teachers whose pensions had been stolen, researchers whose life-saving work had been defunded, charitable organizations that could no longer serve vulnerable populations because their resources had been diverted to Richard's personal accounts. As the jury filed out to deliberate, Sarah sat with her family and friends, feeling strangely peaceful despite the uncertainty ahead. Whatever the verdict, she had chosen truth over convenience, principles over profit, love over professional advancement. The woman who'd missed her mother's funeral to close a fraudulent deal no longer existed. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Sarah, this is Helen's friend Margaret from the book club. We've been following the trial. Your mother would be so proud of the woman you've become." The verdict would determine Richard's fate, but Sarah's transformation was already complete. She had become someone her mother could be proud of, someone worthy of the love she'd nearly thrown away in pursuit of empty achievements. Outside the courthouse windows, Manhattan's skyline stretched toward an October sky that promised change. Whatever came next, Sarah Mitchell would face it as Helen's daughter, rather than Richard Blackstone's creation. 6 months after the verdict, guilty. On all counts, with Richard Blackstone sentenced to 12 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $53 million in restitution, Sarah stood in a small office in Brooklyn Heights, looking out at the harbor where ships carried honest cargo between continents. The view was modest compared to her former corner office in Manhattan, but it belonged to something she'd built rather than something she'd inherited through moral compromise. Mitchell and Chen Ethical Consulting occupied the second floor of a converted brownstone, its mission statement etched in simple brass letters on the door. Integrity in action. What had begun as an impossible dream during the darkest days of the trial had grown into a thriving practice that helped whistleblowers navigate the treacherous waters of exposing corporate corruption. The Hartwell Industries case just settled, Marcus announced, entering with coffee and the satisfaction of someone who'd found meaningful work. $18 million in damages, and 3 executives facing criminal charges. Maria Santos sends her thanks for helping her find the courage to come forward. Sarah smiled, remembering the terrified accountant who'd discovered her manufacturing company was dumping toxic waste into groundwater near an elementary school. Like Sarah 6 months ago, Maria had faced the choice between career security and moral responsibility. Unlike Sarah, she'd had experienced guides to help her navigate the aftermath of choosing conscience over convenience. "Any word from Victoria?" Marcus asked, settling into the chair across from Sarah's desk, a piece they'd bought secondhand but refinished together, building something beautiful from discarded materials. "She's in Seattle today, meeting with the Cancer Research Foundation. The recovered funds should fully restore their treatment programs." Sarah turned from the window, studying the wall where they displayed letters from clients whose lives had been changed by their willingness to support ethical stands. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Richard had succeeded in destroying my credibility." "He didn't succeed because the truth doesn't depend on the messenger's reputation," Marcus replied. "Though it helped that you found the courage to be messenger anyway." Their relationship had deepened through shared adversity into something Sarah had never experienced, partnership based on mutual respect and common values rather than professional convenience. They'd discovered that love built on integrity felt fundamentally different from attraction based on shared ambition. The afternoon brought Sarah's weekly ritual, the drive to Connecticut for dinner with her father and monthly visit to her mother's grave. The yellow colonial looked better than it had in years, its windows bright with new curtains and its garden carefully tended by James and his wife, who'd moved in to keep David company through his adjustment to widowhood. "How's business?" David asked over pot roast that tasted like childhood memories. "Growing faster than we expected? Apparently, there are more people with corrupted consciences than we imagined." Sarah's tone was light, but the underlying reality was sobering. Each new client represented another institution where greed had overwhelmed integrity, another workplace where speaking truth required extraordinary courage. "Your mother always said corruption thrived in silence," David observed. "She believed the only way to fight it was by making noise." After dinner, Sarah drove to Riverside Cemetery as October twilight painted the Connecticut hills in shades of gold and crimson. Her mother's grave was marked by a simple granite stone that bore Helen's favorite verse from Scripture. "What does the Lord require of you but to do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God?" Sarah knelt beside the headstone and withdrew. Her mother's letters. Not to read them again, but to fulfill a promise she'd made 6 months ago. "I finally understand what you were trying to tell me," she said aloud, her voice carrying across the quiet cemetery. "Success isn't about accumulating achievements or climbing hierarchies. It's about using whatever talents we have in service of something larger than ourselves." She opened the first letter, the one that had broken her heart with its expression of restrained longing, and began reading aloud. For the next hour, she shared every word her mother had written but never sent, giving voice to love that had persevered through years of professional distance and deliberate isolation. "I know you can't hear me," Sarah continued when the last letter was finished. But I hope somehow you know that your daughter finally came home. Not to this place, but to the values you spent 30 years teaching. I'm using my expertise to protect people instead of exploiting them. I'm building relationships based on truth instead of professional advantage. I'm living like someone you could be proud of. A gentle breeze stirred the fallen leaves around Helen's grave, and Sarah felt something she chose to interpret as maternal approval. She'd never know if her mother's spirit actually lingered in this peaceful place, but she'd discovered that love didn't require certainty, only commitment to honoring what that love had tried to teach. Driving back to Brooklyn as stars emerged over the Hudson Valley, Sarah thought about the path that had brought her from Richard's gleaming tower to her modest office in Brooklyn Heights. She'd lost everything she thought mattered: the partnership, the prestige, the financial security that had motivated 18 years of relentless climbing. But in return, she'd gained something infinitely more valuable: the ability to sleep peacefully, knowing her work helped rather than harmed, the joy of relationships based on authenticity rather than utility, the deep satisfaction of building something meaningful rather than merely profitable. Her phone rang as she crossed the Brooklyn Bridge, Marcus's name appearing on the dashboard display. "How was your visit?" he asked, his voice warm with understanding. "Perfect. I told her about the foundation we're starting for whistleblower support, about the scholarship fund in her name for ethics education, about the woman her daughter finally became." "And what did she say?" Sarah looked out at Manhattan's lights, reflecting on the harbor, thinking about the city where she'd lost herself and the outer borough where she'd been found. She said that some prices are worth paying, and some foundations are worth rebuilding from scratch. As she pulled into the parking space behind their brownstone office, Sarah felt the deep contentment that comes from alignment between values and actions. Tomorrow would bring new clients seeking courage to expose corruption, new challenges in the endless battle between integrity and institutional power. But tonight, she was simply Helen Mitchell's daughter, finally living up to the legacy of love and principle that had been her inheritance all along. The price of ambition, Sarah had learned, wasn't measured in what you gained, but in what you were willing to sacrifice. True success meant choosing foundations that would support not just your achievements, but your ability to sleep peacefully with the person those achievements had helped you become. Standing beneath Brooklyn's stars, Sarah Mitchell was finally home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.